The trial begins. Introduction. The courtroom silence. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt almost suffocating. Every eye was on the elderly man standing before the judge's podium, his wrinkled hands resting with quiet dignity on the polished wooden surface. His glasses sat low on his nose, and his eyes, though aged, radiated wisdom rather than anger. He was calm, measured, and composed, embodying years of experience that few in the room could even begin to understand. The air was heavy, charged with a tension that only those who knew the system's inequities could truly feel. Judge Bradley Pierce, on the other hand, was not at all concerned with the quiet wisdom before him. His sharp eyes glittered with a mixture of arrogance and contempt as he leaned forward, preparing to deliver what he no doubt thought was the final blow. It was a moment he relished, the moment he got to crush someone's spirit, to remind them that they were at his mercy. "You are being fined $500 for a minor parking violation," Judge Pierce announced coldly, his voice slicing through the silence like a knife. "This court has no room for excuses." His lips curled into a small smirk, as if he was enjoying the discomfort of the elderly man standing before him. The courtroom buzzed quietly with murmurs of disbelief. $500 for a parking violation? It was absurd, a fine so steep for something that most would consider trivial. But no one dared to speak up. No one dared to challenge the power of Judge Pierce. He was known for his arrogance and his iron grip over the courtroom, and anyone who dared question him soon learned the consequences of doing so. The elderly man, however, stood still. His expression didn't waver. There was no anger, no frustration in his eyes, just quiet patience. He simply adjusted his glasses, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." First, Judge Pierce didn't respond. He simply looked at the man, an eyebrow raised in disbelief. A misunderstanding? It was as if the idea that someone could challenge him in his own court was laughable. He had dealt with countless defendants who crumbled under his gaze, whose spirits were crushed by his commands. But this man, this calm, collected elderly figure, was different. Pierce scoffed, his smirk growing wider. "A misunderstanding?" Pierce repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You parked in a restricted zone. It's a clear violation. You should be grateful that I'm not increasing your fine." The elderly man nodded slightly, as if he had anticipated this response. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet. The room was deathly silent as the man took out 5 crisp $100 bills, placing them on the podium with deliberate calmness. The tension in the room deepened. This wasn't the reaction anyone had expected. The arrogance of Judge Pierce was usually met with trembling fear or anger, but this man, this stranger, had remained poised, paying the fine as though it meant nothing to him. "Very well," the elderly man said softly, his voice carrying a weight that no one had anticipated. "I will pay the fine." He turned to walk away, his movements slow but sure, as though he were not at all concerned with the outcome. But just as Pierce prepared to move on, the voice of someone in the back of the courtroom cut through the silence. "Your Honor," the voice called, firm but respectful. "I think you should know who you just fined." The secret unveiled. The words hung in the air, charged with an energy that none of the people in the courtroom could ignore. Every head turned toward the back, and for the first time, Judge Pierce's smug expression faltered. He frowned, uncertainty creeping into his mind. Who was this man, and why was everyone suddenly whispering? The elderly man, still calm, turned his head slightly, his face unreadable. He didn't react to the murmurs or the curiosity that spread through the room. He knew that what was about to happen would change everything, but he didn't allow it to show. At that moment, the truth about the elderly man was about to be revealed in the most unexpected way. A few days before this court hearing, Richard Hayes had woken up early in the morning. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the quiet neighborhood where he had lived for more than 40 years. He was a man of routine, someone who had spent his life helping those around him, offering a word of advice, a friendly gesture, or a lesson on life to those who needed it. At 76 years old, Richard was no longer as swift as he used to be, but his mind was still sharp, capable of outwitting even the most cunning of adversaries. His neighbors knew him as a kind, humble man, but what they didn't know, what he never boasted about, was that he had spent decades as one of the most respected law professors in the country, shaping the legal minds of tomorrow. Richard didn't seek fame or recognition for his work. He had always preferred to stay behind the scenes, quietly shaping the future of law. But when his former student, now a young defense attorney, invited him to witness a trial, Richard decided to attend. He had no idea that this simple decision would lead him to one of the most important moments of his life. The day had started like any other, with traffic jams, honking cars, and frustrated drivers. Richard had gone to the courthouse to watch the case, but the parking lot was full, and street parking was a nightmare. However, as fate would have it, he spotted an empty parking space near the courthouse entrance. A sign warned no parking between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., but a quick glance at his watch told him it was 9:57 a.m. He knew he'd be back before the time restriction began. In the rush, he didn't anticipate the security check, which caused a delay of 10 minutes. When he returned to his car, the bright orange ticket was there, taunting him. A $500 fine for 10 minutes. Richard wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. He was simply amused at the absurdity of it all. But little did he know, this parking ticket was about to bring him face to face with a man who would challenge everything he had stood for. A man who would force him to take a stand for something greater than himself. The unraveling of power. The moment of revelation. The room was charged with a new energy, one that rippled through the walls like an electric current. Every pair of eyes turned from the elderly man to the young defense attorney who had spoken up. The tension in the air was palpable as Judge Pierce's arrogance began to waver for the first time in years. He was used to being in control, to having the final word, to watching people shrink under his gaze. But now something was happening. His usual smugness faltered as the weight of his own ignorance bore down on him. The young defense attorney, Daniel Carter, stood confidently, his eyes locked on the judge. He had no fear, no hesitation in his voice as he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, "the man you just fined isn't just any citizen." Judge Pierce frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" he snapped. Daniel smiled, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "This man," he said, turning to Richard Hayes, "is Professor Richard Hayes, one of the most respected legal minds in this country. The man who helped shape the very principles you claim to uphold." The room fell silent. Gasps rippled through the audience as the truth of the elderly man's identity settled in. Judge Pierce's smirk evaporated completely, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. He had just fined one of the most respected law professors of his time for something as trivial as a parking violation. Richard, for his part, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his hands clasped calmly in front of him. His expression remained neutral, as though this was all just a matter of course. He wasn't seeking revenge, wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't even angry. What mattered to him was the principle at stake, the idea that justice should be blind, but it should also be fair. For a moment, Judge Pierce was speechless. His arrogance, his unwavering belief in his own power, had just been shattered in one simple sentence. But he was determined not to show weakness. "I don't care who he is," Pierce finally snapped, regaining his composure. "The law applies to everyone equally." Richard Hayes nodded slowly, his expression still composed. "Indeed, Your Honor, the law applies to everyone, but so does justice." The courtroom held its collective breath, the weight of those words hanging in the air. It was a subtle challenge, a quiet call to action that no one could ignore. The real battle begins. As the scene unfolded, it became clear that the issue at hand was not just a parking violation. This was about power and justice. It was about the willingness to confront authority when it was abused and the courage to speak up against a system that had been manipulated for far too long. Judge Pierce had built his career on a foundation of intimidation. He ruled with an iron fist, punishing those who dared defy him. But in the presence of Richard Hayes, a man who had spent his life teaching the law and upholding justice, Pierce's power seemed like a brittle facade, ready to crack. Daniel Carter, the young defense attorney, wasn't finished. He stepped forward, holding up an old leather-bound book, a well-worn legal textbook that had seen years of use. The pages were yellowed, the cover cracked, but the significance of the book could not be understated. "Do you recognize this, Your Honor?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm. Judge Pierce squinted at the book. "What is this?" he asked, his tone dismissive. "This," Daniel said, "is a book that Professor Richard Hayes authored. It's called The Principles of Justice and Fairness in American Law, and it's required reading in every law school across the country. The very principles you claim to uphold, Judge Pierce, they were written by the man you just fined." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge, who had once been untouchable, now stood exposed. His arrogance had clouded his judgment, and in doing so, he had made a powerful enemy. Judge Pierce, ever the master of deflection, quickly tried to regain control. "This is irrelevant," he barked, his voice trembling slightly. "The law is the law. It doesn't matter who he is. It doesn't matter who wrote the book." But Daniel wasn't done. "Perhaps," he said. "But what's interesting is that you just find a man who wrote the very laws you claim to enforce. And now, Your Honor, I think it's time we looked a little deeper into how these laws have been enforced in your courtroom. The unraveling of the judge's power." The conversation had shifted, and with it, the power dynamic in the courtroom. What had started as a trivial matter, a simple parking fine, had now turned into a full-blown investigation into the actions of Judge Pierce. Richard Hayes, without saying much, had already made his point. Justice was not about enforcing the law blindly, but about applying it with fairness and wisdom. But as the case progressed, it became clear that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Daniel Carter, ever the strategist, had planted the seed of doubt in the minds of everyone present. Richard Hayes had spent decades teaching the difference between enforcing the law and upholding justice. And now, Judge Pierce's actions were under intense scrutiny. Daniel wasn't finished with his line of questioning. He stood before the judge, his voice unwavering. "You see, Your Honor, the problem isn't just that you fined Professor Hayes. It's that you've been imposing excessive fines, using your position to crush people's spirits, to make them feel powerless. And that's not justice. That's abuse of power." At this point, Judge Pierce's facade of confidence had completely cracked. He was no longer the untouchable figure he had once been. His smugness had faded into something far more dangerous. Panic. The realization that he had been caught, that his actions had been exposed, was beginning to sink in. And then the real shock came, a deeper conspiracy uncovered. The courtroom doors swung open, and a young woman entered, breathless and holding a stack of papers. She rushed up to the court clerk and whispered something urgently in his ear. The clerk's face went pale as he looked at the papers in his hands. He turned to the judge, his voice trembling. "Your Honor," the clerk said, "I believe you're going to want to see this." Judge Pierce narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "What is this?" he demanded. The clerk hesitated before handing over the papers. Judge Pierce flipped through them, his face gradually draining of color as he read. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. "What is this?" Pierce repeated, his voice barely a whisper now. "These are legal petitions, Your Honor," Daniel Carter said, stepping forward. "Petitions that have been filed by dozens of people who have appeared in your courtroom. People who've been unfairly fined, pressured into plea deals, and dismissed without just cause. And now, these petitions are about to expose something far more serious. You're not just guilty of poor judgment, Judge. You're guilty of corruption." The final judgment. The calm before the storm. As the courtroom grew quiet, the tension reached a breaking point. Richard Hayes, ever the composed figure, remained silently in his place. There was no need for words now. The wheels of justice were turning, and they would not stop. The revelation that Judge Pierce was involved in corruption had shocked everyone in the room. But this was just the beginning. The layers of deceit and manipulation had started to peel away, and the truth was now in full view. But despite the chaos and uncertainty, Richard's demeanor never faltered. He had spent his entire life teaching future lawyers the importance of upholding not only the law, but also the spirit of justice. His goal had never been to destroy Pierce or anyone else, but to expose the truth. And now the stage was set for that truth to come crashing down. Judge Pierce, however, was not yet willing to accept his defeat. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of the corner he had backed himself into. His arrogance had served him well for many years, and he couldn't fathom the idea that it might be his downfall. He tried to reassert his authority, slamming his gavel with a force that reverberated through the room. "This case is closed," Judge Pierce snapped, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Mr. Hayes has paid his fine. There's nothing more to discuss." But Daniel Carter, the young defense attorney who had been the driving force behind exposing Pierce's corruption, wasn't ready to let him off the hook. "Actually, Your Honor, there is more to discuss," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "We're not done here. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of the corruption in this courtroom. The investigation unfolds. It wasn't just about the $500 fine anymore. It wasn't even about Richard Hayes's moment of personal justice. The revelation of Judge Pierce's corruption had opened the door to something far bigger. Daniel Carter had spent years studying the justice system, understanding its flaws and the deep-rooted problems that allowed men like Pierce to thrive. But now, with the evidence Daniel and Richard had uncovered, there was a chance to change the system, to expose the dark underbelly of power that allowed corruption to flourish unchecked. Daniel turned to the court clerk, who had handed over the petition that had started this chain of events. "You said that these petitions had been filed by people who were unfairly treated in this courtroom, right?" Daniel asked. The clerk nodded, his face pale with realization. "Then it's time to let the world see what's been happening behind these walls." Richard stood tall beside Daniel, his voice steady as he addressed the room once more. "Justice is not just about enforcing laws. It's about fairness. It's about making sure that those who hold power are held accountable for their actions. This court has been a place of injustice for far too long, and that ends today." The words hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. Richard's calm presence, paired with Daniel's unwavering determination, sent a clear message. The system was broken, and it was time for it to be fixed. The unraveling of Judge Pierce's empire. The investigation into Judge Pierce's conduct didn't take long. With the legal petitions, the forensic audits, and the mounting testimonies of those he had wronged, the walls of Pierce's empire began to crumble. It was revealed that the judge had been using his position to funnel money from excessive fines, court settlements, and other illicit sources into offshore accounts. Millions of dollars had disappeared, and the trail led straight back to him. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Judge Pierce had not acted alone. There were others involved, people in high places who had turned a blind eye to his actions for years. And now, thanks to the courage of Richard Hayes and Daniel Carter, those people would finally be exposed. But Judge Pierce's arrogance didn't allow him to go quietly. Even as the evidence against him mounted, he continued to deny the charges, insisting that he had done nothing wrong. His resistance only made the inevitable more painful. The public's trust in him was shattered, and soon, the media picked up the story, broadcasting the fall of the once unassailable judge across the country. A new chapter for justice. The day of reckoning came for Judge Bradley Pierce. Federal agents arrived at his office with an arrest warrant, taking him into custody for his role in the corruption scandal. As he was escorted out of the courthouse in handcuffs, the once proud judge was met with stares of disbelief from the very people he had once lorded over. The power he had wielded with such arrogance had evaporated in an instant. As the news of his arrest spread, people across the country began to realize the depth of the corruption that had been allowed to fester in the justice system. It wasn't just about one bad judge. It was about a broken system that had allowed individuals like Pierce to thrive unchecked. But now, with his fall, there was hope. The truth had come to light, and it was clear that change was on the horizon. For Richard Hayes, the battle was far from over. He had exposed the corruption, but the fight for justice was just beginning. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The system wasn't going to change overnight, and there were many more powerful figures who would do everything in their power to protect their own interests. But Richard was undeterred. He had spent his life teaching young lawyers about the difference between enforcing the law and upholding justice, and now he was going to live by those principles. The impact of one man's stand. Richard's courage had sparked a movement. His actions, though rooted in personal principles, had resonated with countless others who had suffered at the hands of a broken system. They saw in Richard a reminder that justice was not a commodity that could be bought or manipulated. It was a fundamental right that needed to be protected at all costs. And for the first time in years, people began to believe that the law could be trusted again. As Richard sat in a quiet park with Daniel, reflecting on the events that had transpired, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. He had done what he could to expose the truth, but he knew that the work wasn't finished. There was much left to be done, but for the first time in a long while, the possibility of a fairer, more just system seemed within reach. Justice is a never-ending battle, Richard said softly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But it's one worth fighting for. Daniel nodded. And we'll keep fighting it, every step of the way. The victory of truth. In the end, Richard Hayes's story was not just about a personal victory against an arrogant judge. It was about the power of truth and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Richard's fight for justice, paired with Daniel's determination to expose corruption, became a symbol of hope for all those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or oppressed by a broken system. The story of Judge Bradley Pierce's fall is a powerful reminder that no one is above the law, and that the fight for justice is something that must be constant, relentless, and unyielding. It is a fight that transcends the individual and speaks to the larger truth that justice, though sometimes elusive, is always worth pursuing. As for Richard Hayes, he may have walked into the courtroom expecting only to pay a simple fine, but he left having sparked a revolution, one that would forever change the way people viewed the power of the legal system. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. The journey to justice is never easy, but it's worth every step. Richard Hayes's stand for what's right shows us that no matter how powerful or untouchable someone may seem, the truth will always prevail. We all have the power to make a difference, whether in a courtroom or in our communities. So what are you going to do next? Will you stand up for justice? Will you speak out when you see something wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your story. Remember, justice is not just for the few, but for all of us. Together, we can make the world a better place.